I'd like to begin by thanking the co-organizers of the Japan Education Forum for inviting me to participate in this very important annual occasion, and especially my colleagues at the Center for the Study of International Cooperation in Education that I have had the great pleasure and honor to spend time there 2 years ago. As my colleague indicated, I'm the director of an annual report. This is an independent report about education for all. It comes out once a year. 11 reports have been completed thus far. And you can even see the report has been translated into the summary into Japanese. So you are kindly requested, if you're interested, to read more about the work that we do at our website, which is not mentioned here, but it is on your in your printed material, www.efareport.unesco.org. Also, as I've indicated, I direct a team of researchers and others who support the work, and it is really their hard work together that we're able to produce this annual report. The next report, the 2015 report, will be launched in April of this year, on April 9th. We will begin our launch events in New Delhi, India, together with the Minister of Human Resource Development, and then we will have launch events in Paris, New York, and Santiago de Chile. We also will be producing a gender summary, a youth report, and a regional overview. So you are invited to follow with the work that the report team has been producing. I will be presenting some of the findings from the 2015 report, but mainly I'll be emphasizing some of the major trends that we can see. My presentation is organized in the following sections. As you can see, I will talk a little bit about the Dakar Education for All agenda and how to assess its impact over the last 15 years. I will mainly spend time talking about progress or the lack of progress that has occurred for each of the 6 EFA goals and include some material about domestic finance. I will also talk a little bit about trends in international aid to education, especially comparing the phenomena in the early part after Dakar, in the years after Dakar, and the most recent information that we have available. I will not spend very much time looking at the explanations for progress, but invite you to look at some of the points made in the PowerPoint presentation that you have before you. I will spend a little bit of time talking about the lessons that are being derived or drawn from the EFA progress as we begin to pivot and develop plans for the next set of development priorities, the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda, and I'll conclude with some ideas that around this point. I will probably need to skip over some of the material since I prepared much too much evidence to present in 30 minutes. So again, I would invite you to look at the materials that have been distributed. Finally, I would like to bring to your attention that the team is also beginning to work on a 2016 report. So at the same time that we are completing the last of the EFA reports, we're beginning to develop our tools for a new set of reports. We'll actually be changing our name. Our new name will be called the Global Education Monitoring Report, or GEM report. And we have a concept note online that you are welcome to come and read and also provide comments. So looking first at the Dakar EFA agenda. Just to remind us, the Dakar World Education Forum that took place in Dakar, Senegal in the year 2000 was convened by 5 international partners. The upcoming meeting of the World Education Forum in Incheon, South Korea will have 7 co-convening partners. There's some additional partners, the ILO and UN Women, that will be convening partners in the next World Education Forum. 164 countries took part, and many NGOs and certainly the international agencies were very much prevalent. Most of the key focus is on the 6 EFA goals, which we will look at each in turn, but there were also several key global strategies that were defined at Dakar, and the next report that we'll be publishing also tries to assess the effectiveness of these 12 strategies. I will not talk about them here. It is important to keep in mind that one of the key elements at Dakar was the commitment of the international community toward member states that if they pledge to make progress on EFA, that no country seriously committed to EFA would be thwarted by the lack of resources. So part of the reason that we spend time looking at the flow of international aid is precisely the commitment that international community made, the donor agencies made to the developing world in order to support progress on EFA. Immediately after the Dakar Forum, there was a substantial increase in international aid. Many countries prepared, as we heard from our colleague in Ethiopia, national education plans, and there was a new monitoring framework that was established in the year 2002, originally directed by my colleague Christopher Calclough from the UK, and he was the one who produced the first EFA report in 2002. Keeping in mind the fact that there are 6 EFA goals, they cover a broad and comprehensive educational policy objectives, everything from early childhood to trying to ensure that every child is in school at the primary level, providing equal access to young people and adults to acquire basic skills, to reduce illiteracy rates by 50%, to achieve gender parity, and to make improvements in the quality of education, including learning outcomes. All of us also recognize the fact that the same year that the EFA goals were established, there were also the Millennium Development Goals that were established by the United Nations in New York. They concentrated on only 2 much more narrowly defined educational priorities. One, UPE, the universalization of primary education and improving completion rates, and secondly, gender parity at the primary and secondary level. The MDG said nothing about early childhood, said nothing about learning, said nothing about skills or literacy. These are things that will be changing in the Sustainable Development Agenda later this year. So as we come to assess progress since Dakar, there are different ways that we can examine the extent to which the international community has made progress and each of the member states have made progress with respect to the EFA agenda. One way would be to examine the extent to which countries have actually attained the targets that had been established. But some of the EFA goals did not establish clear, measurable targets. For example, Goal 3 talks about the importance of access to life skills and other kinds of skills, but there was no clear, measurable target. So it's difficult sometimes to assess the extent to which there's been progress. But many of the reports in the past have examined the extent to which countries are on track or off track to obtain and achieve the key EFA targets that the countries had committed themselves to. Another way to look at this, and this is the way that I will present here today on some of the EFA goals, is to ask the question, to what extent was there progress before Dakar? What was the pace of that progress? And to what extent did the EFA movement quicken the pace of progress after the year 2000. In other words, do we see a kind of a bending of the curve? Do we see a quickening of progress that has been made since Dakar that would not have been made if the EFA agenda had not been established? It's a difficult question to assess, but some of the evidence that I will present to you attempts to do so. So now I will go through each of the 6 EFA goals, one after the other, and provide some summary remarks for you to look at. We begin with Goal 1 that looks at early childhood education, and here there are 2 components. One is the care component, which essentially is very similar to the MDG goals of trying to reduce childhood mortality, the mortality of children under the age of 5, and also to reduce malnutrition, which is often measured by stunting, the extent to which children are malnourished. And in both of these areas, we see that there has been progress, although there's still very unacceptably high levels of malnutrition in certain regions of the world, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. But again, these are goals or measurable targets that mainly are relevant to the MDG agenda and less to the EFA agenda. The education part of the early childhood goal examines the extent to which there have been increases in the number of young children, primarily between the ages of 3 and 5 or 3 and 6, depending on the national education system, the extent to which they are participating in a recognized pre-primary education program. And here we see that there have been indications of progress. The gross enrollment rates at pre-primary level have gone up in quite a few countries, but many of them started at very low levels in 1999 or 2000 and have gone up since. The proportion or share of pre-primary enrollments in private institutions is relatively high at this level, much higher than it is at the primary or secondary level. However, and this is an important however, the goal talks about the importance of enrolling children in pre-primary education who come from more vulnerable and disadvantaged backgrounds. And here the evidence is quite clear that most of the children that are gaining access to pre-primary education mainly come from middle-class families or wealthier households, and not necessarily from poor families or from disadvantaged backgrounds. So even though we have enormous evidence about the powerful effect of a year or several years of pre-primary education and care, we do not see clear evidence that from the global perspective, that marginalized children have been brought in. Once again, here we see some of the data that we've collected. This shows the trends before Dakar. The one thing to be very clear about here is that there was very little movement before Dakar in several regions, except for, given the collapse of the former Soviet Union that had relatively high rates of participation in pre-primary education prior to Dakar. After the Soviet Union was disassembled or disestablished, many of these pre-primary programs were very much challenged financially, and many children lost access. So we see the decline, for example, in Central Asia. However, when we look at the trends after Dakar, we see that all of these regions are beginning to move upward, and the downward trend that we had seen in Central Asia had turned around. So here is evidence quite clear that Dakar had an impact as we compare the trends before, during the 1990s, to those that we see post-2000. This is the global average of pre-primary enrollments at the gross pre-primary enrollment rate, and we have projected this figure to 2015, and the gross primary enrollment rate in 2015 is approximately a little less than 60%. Moving then to the second goal, the universalization of primary education. we see that there has been considerable progress in the numbers of out-of-school children that have been brought into school, Ethiopia being an excellent example of that progress. At the time of Dakar, there were approximately 104 million children who were officially unregistered and enrolled in primary education. This was brought down to about 57 million in about 2010, and since then that number has stagnated, and that's one of the big stories over the last couple of years. We see very little evidence of a reduction in the number of out-of-school children in the last several years. Most of this, so the adjusted net enrollment rate at the primary level for the world as a whole has gone up, but we still see that the poorest children are 4 times more likely than the richest children to be out of school. This is based on a new study that came out a couple weeks ago from UNICEF and UNESCO's Institute for Statistics. It's also important to point out that approximately 1/3 of all the 57 million children out of school are living in conflict-affected countries or conflict-affected zones in particular countries. And about half of these children are expected never to have the opportunity to attend school. This is all with respect to access. The other part of this goal talks about ensuring that every child not only gains access to primary school, but completes a primary school cycle of 5 years or 6 years. Here the evidence is much less convincing, and we see that although countries may have succeeded in bringing many children to school and enrolling them, many of these countries haven't succeeded as well. Again, Ethiopia is a very good example in ensuring that all the children who come to school finish a 5 or 6 year cycle. So completion rates, unlike access rates, have not been as they've not been as impressive in terms of the overall achievements over the last couple of years. Here we see the net enrollment rate for the primary level. Here we see how it's been increasing since Dakar, and we also see how it's been leveling off in certain regions. The other way to look at this is to look at the number of out-of-school children, and here we see again the impact of Dakar, how in 2000 the numbers not only before 2000 the numbers were quite level and even increasing, and that after Dakar we see a very dramatic decline, a reduction in the number of out-of-school children, especially up until about 2008. This was especially due to the efforts of India and other countries in Southwest Asia. And if we had followed these trends, we should have been in a much better situation this year than in fact we are, because we see that over the last couple of years, the number of out-of-school children have stagnated or leveled off, and now it is not at all clear that we are still far from achieving a universal primary education. Goal 3, moving along, as I've indicated, is a more difficult goal to measure, and essentially what we have done is to use a proxy measure, which is the extent to which children have access to secondary education, under the assumption that important labor market skills are obtained by children at the secondary level, and therefore if they gain access to secondary education, they're more likely to improve their opportunities in the labor market. And so we also see that the gross enrollment rate, that's what GER stands for, has improved in particular at the lower secondary level, the first 2 or 3 years of secondary education, and has improved also at the upper secondary level, but from a lower starting point. It's important to keep in mind, and this is something that will have an impact in the post-2015 era, is that increasingly many countries are thinking about a basic education cycle of 9 years, which would include 6 years of primary education and 3 years of lower secondary education. So instead of universalizing primary education, which was one of the key components of the Dakar framework, the post-2015 key goal will talk about the universalization of basic education that would include primary and lower secondary, and perhaps even 1 year of pre-primary. So this is one of the big changes. And here too, we can look at how many children are out of school, how many young people are out of school. And as we saw in the primary level, once again, after Dakar, there has been a decline in the number of out-of-school adolescents, both in the world and in many different parts, different regions of the world. But since the 2008, the number of adolescents out of school has stagnated. So if you add up the number of out-of-school primary students and the out-of-school adolescents, you will come up with a number of around 110 million students. And this will be the focus of attention in the coming years in the post-2015 framework. How to bring all of the out-of-school primary age students and the lower secondary age students into school. This will be, I think, the target of much attention. Goal 4 looks at literacy. Literacy rates were meant to, illiteracy rates were meant to reduce by 50% over the 50% over the course of the Dakar period, and most countries will fall short of this target and will only achieve about half of that target. The adult illiteracy rate is approximately 16%, which means that about 1 in every 5, 1 in every 6 adults in the world over the age of 15 has been denied the right to basic literacy skills. And this is based on a very indirect assessment of literacy, and if anything, it underestimates the extent of the literacy or illiteracy problem in the world. Most of the evidence would indicate that improvements in literacy rates are primarily due to more young people entering school and entering adulthood, and those adults who had been illiterate are dying and no longer part of the adult population. So literacy programs have been shown to be less effective than, in a sense, the change in the composition of adults, with a greater proportion of adults having attended at least primary education, and this is what we refer to as the cohort replacement trend. There have been important improvements in measuring skills. Many of you are familiar with the OECD study called PIAC, and also the World Bank has been involved in developing new instruments to measure direct assessment of adult skills. These are still very much in the pilot stage, and there's much work to be done in the future in the post-2015 era in relation to trying to measure important skills beyond literacy and numeracy that would be looked at in the post-2015 era. Going on to gender parity, the goal 5, we see that there is a significant progress at the primary level in the proportion of countries. By the way, this is not the actual data that you have on your, this is something I changed for the presentation today. But essentially we see that the proportion of countries that have reached gender parity at the primary level has increased significantly from about 53% to 70%, and also at the secondary level has increased over this period of time. But the goal talks about countries achieving gender parity at both the primary and the secondary level, and here only 30% of countries in the world have achieved gender parity at both the primary and the secondary level. Part of the reason is that gender parity at the upper secondary level is often based on the fact that many boys drop out of school after the age of 16, so that there's an advantage to girls relative to boys, whereas in many other countries there is a underachievement of girls relative to boys. So there are two different kinds of trends in the disparities that we look at the secondary level. Moving on to the question of of quality, which is clearly the focus of much attention in the post-2015 development agenda. Here, one of the things that we have done, and I'll show the statistics in just a moment, is that we have compiled evidence of the number of countries around the world that have been carrying out national learning assessments. This is a very new phenomena. This goes beyond the kinds of assessments that you're mainly familiar with, the PISA, the TIMSS, the PEARLS, the OECD and the IEA studies. And in sub-Saharan Africa, there are regional assessments, and also in Latin America, a regional assessment. But one of the things that we see is that although there have not been noticeable increases in learning levels, that countries are devoting a lot more attention to the assessment of learning, and they are carrying out assessments of different varying quality, and we see, I'll show you the information in just a moment. And also, on the other hand, with teachers, there's still a big gap, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, in the number of teachers that need to be trained to provide opportunities for many of the young people who are entering school, and pupil-teacher ratios are still extremely high in many countries, over 40 students per teacher, and not all of the teachers that have been given the opportunity to enter the classroom have been adequately trained according to national standards. Here, for example, is the information about national learning assessments, and you can see that in Asia Pacific, in the Arab states, in Central Asia, there have been huge increases over the course of the last 15 years in the proportion of countries that have carried out a national learning assessment that is meant to improve the quality of education being provided. Again, this does not include end-of-cycle examinations. It does not include EGRA, the early grade reading assessment or early grade math assessment that has been proposed by the World Bank, and this is essentially different kinds of national learning assessments, and I think this is an area that will deserve a lot more attention in the coming years. Here's the information on the pupil-teacher ratios. You can see on the left-hand side that after Dakar, because so many children came into the system, pupil-teacher ratios increased, which reduced quality because there were so many children per teacher, and it's only been in recent years that we begin to see that the numbers of students per teacher are beginning to decline as more teachers have been trained and have been moving into the system. Let me briefly talk a little bit about domestic finance. Here we mainly see, and here Ethiopia is a bit of an exception, that most countries have increased a little bit the share of their gross national product that's allocated to education. This is certainly the case in many of the low-income countries, but the share of their budget has often stagnated. Again, the figures that we saw from our colleague from Ethiopia really is one of the exceptional cases where the government has really prioritized education relative to other countries. I know you can't see the figures here, but the countries on the far left are the ones that have really increased, the ones in the middle have decreased, and many of the ones in the right-hand side are the ones that have changed just a little bit by 5%. Let me just briefly say something about international aid flows, and we can see here that although there was a huge increase after Dakar in the amount of dollars that the rich countries and donors were giving for education, that this began to stagnate at the point of about 2009, and in fact has declined over the last 2 or 3 years. Here you also see the breakdown of the aid into basic education, secondary education, and post-secondary education. Here the term basic education is different than the way I used it previously. Basic education here refers to primary, early childhood, and adult literacy programs all together. So it's a little bit different than the way basic education was used in the previous slides. Most of the aid that goes to basic education is in fact for primary education. Here we see the differences between the early part, just after Dakar, and the most recent evidence that we have. Many of the largest donors to education have been reallocating from basic education to post-secondary education. As you know, countries that invite students to attend their universities and provide scholarships, this gets included as part of the aid that the country gives for education, even though the monies stay within the countries. This has also been an important emphasis of the Japanese policy in this area. But Japan is not the only country that has followed this policy. It's also true for France and from Germany, which you see a little bit on the side here. There has, I'm going to go through these very quickly here because I do want to show you this slide that one of the big issues over the last couple of years is the extent to which the aid that's being provided is going to the countries most in need of the aid. So the question has been, is the aid going to low-income countries and to conflict-affected countries? And here we see some evidence that different donors have been more attentive and more sensitive to the importance of directing their aid to the countries most in need. And the Global Partnership in Education has been an example of good practice in that it has been increasing since the early 2000s, that more of its aid is going both to low-income countries and also to conflict-affected countries. This is true to a lesser extent of UNESCO, and some of the other donors have not targeted as much of their international aid to the countries most in need. I will very briefly have to skip over, I think, the information I have about Japan. I do apologize, but you can look at this at your leisure. Let me then briefly talk about, I think, the key lessons that have been learned from the assessments and monitoring progress, and how these are being integrated into the post-2015 development agenda. First of all, it's important from the evidence that I presented here that you understand that EFA was conceived as an integrated, holistic policy that was meant to include education at all the different levels for young children and also for adults, and that in practice, although national commitments to the EFA agenda were there, in practice the progress has been very uneven. So most of the progress that we've seen is primarily in bringing more kids to primary education, a lesser extent it's lower secondary, and in improving gender parity. In some ways what we see is that countries have followed the priorities of the MDGs and less the priorities of the EFA movement. So one of the lessons that has been learned from this two-track set of policies is that the international education community has been trying to align to the greatest extent possible its priorities for post-2015 with those of the international development community that has been working out of New York. So we have the progress that's been going on in the Muscat Accord or Agreement last year in July, and also the attempt by UNESCO and UNICEF and some of the other international stakeholders to try to have an influence on the open working group targets in education, that they would better reflect the international education community. So instead of having two separate tracks, the post-2015 agenda is trying to align to the greatest extent possible the education priorities and the development priorities, unlike what happened between EFA and MDG. We also see that one of the big problems in the EFA agenda was that some of the concepts that were used, like life skills, like quality, were concepts that were not well defined. In some sense, in some instances, they were contested. There were no clear measurement instruments with respect to some of the goals, and the quality of data that was provided was partial and often lagged in time. So here we see that one of the things moving in the work moving toward the post-2015 agenda has been an extensive public consultation process in which many different stakeholders have been asked to inform the open working group and the kind of targets and even indicators that they would be using for the post-2015 development agenda. So there's been an attempt through this public consultation process to try to clarify the concepts, to have very clear measurement instruments or targets within each of these, and this is one of the lessons that has been learned from the EFA movement. We also see that one of the lessons is that the international commitment was very strong after Dakar, but began to dissipate after the first 5 to 6 to 8 years. And so the will of the international community to support many developing countries began to wane in most recent years. So one of the lessons then for the post-2015 agenda is to not have an agenda that is only oriented toward countries in the global south, but rather to have an ambitious universal agenda that would be applicable and relevant and meaningful for all the countries in the world, rather than focusing solely on countries in the global south. So clearly the idea of trying to bring all countries into the conversation is meant to be a way of trying to ensure heightened political will and commitment over an extended period of time after 2015. I've mentioned a little bit these two tracks. This is just a way to visualize that. Here you can see, I think the main point that I was trying to make is in the arrow that goes from the May 2014 meeting in Oman, in Muscat, Oman, where the international education community tried to influence the open working group policies, and in fact succeeded, although not completely, in defining the new, in aligning the targets of these two communities. This week, as we meet, the EFA Steering Committee is meeting in Paris, and in some ways is going to establish what will be the international education community's approach to looking at these open working group targets that have been defined. I won't go through them. As you know, there are 7 targets and 3 means of implementation. I can tell you that the Global Monitoring Report has produced a kind of a critique of the open working group targets. This critique hopefully will be available for dissemination quite soon on our website. We have not attempted to reformulate what we think would be better targets in the future, but to provide a basis for the international community to have a constructive conversation about some of the limitations and some of the problems that we see in the current open working group education targets as currently being defined. This document is being presented to the EFA Steering Committee today as we speak, and we hope to be able to share it with many other people in the coming days, and I invite you to take a look at it. So, in conclusion, the EFA movement has succeeded, but only in part. It's certainly, there is evidence of a quickening pace of progress on some of the EFA goals, but not all of them. There has been some progress in domestic finance, but it's mainly due to the fact that countries are getting richer and therefore they have more money for education, not because they're actually increasing the share of their budget to education and prioritizing education. International aid to education increased, but has stagnated. And what I haven't been able to present, very few of the 12 strategies that were also defined at Dakar have been implemented in full and were fully effective. So as we see, much of the efforts now are looking at the post-2015 policies and defining the targets. As we've seen, the post-2015 educational debate includes many more actors. It's a much broader consultation process than in the past. There are many more experts and others that are trying to develop greater consensus around the priorities that are being put together for the coming 15 years. There's a greater emphasis in the post-2015 targets on access to all levels of education and much emphasis on the outcomes of education, on learning, on basic skill acquisition, on equity, and especially to links with the other sustainable development sector priorities. So there's clearly also widespread consensus about the need to establish an independent monitoring and assessment mechanism, and we think that the GMR model has been very successful in that regard. Thank you very much for your attention.